Hello, my name is Joe Sumners. I'm Director of the Economic and Community Development Institute at Auburn University. We are a partnership between Auburn University Outreach and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. We do training, we do technical assistance and work with communities. And that's why I'm talking to you today. I'm going to talk about some experiences that we've had working in communities in Alabama, particularly the Alabama Black Belt, which is an area in the western part of Alabama with very high poverty, high unemployment, and poor economic performance. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Some have called the Black Belt Alabama's third world. There was a series of articles in the Birmingham News back in 2002 that looked at the Alabama Black Belt, and this is what they said. The once lordly region, born in days when cotton was king and slaves built the kingdom, has become a blighted land of forgotten promise. It is, according to statistical measures and the people who struggle to improve life in the region, Alabama's third world. A visitor to the Black Belt finds counties with sick economies that have dwindled for decades. A child in the Black Belt is more likely to be born out of wedlock, more likely to come home to poverty, and more likely to die in the first year of life. A man in the Black Belt is more likely to drop out of school before the 9th grade, leave the mother of his children, and die of heart disease. Doctors and hospitals are so scarce that pregnant women and sick residents must travel up to 30 miles to the nearest health clinic. There's no local bus service, and as many as a quarter of all households have no car. Infant death rates during parts of the 1990s surpassed those in Panama and Uruguay. The percentage of births to teenage mothers is higher than in Uganda and Indonesia. Further, officials cannot recruit or keep high-paying businesses in an area that lacks an educated workforce, and they can't improve education without the tax base that business would provide. So there's nothing to draw new residents to the Black Belt. There's little to keep the region's people rooted to their ancestral land. Since the beginning of the 20th century, in a trend that has continued for 100 years, residents have fled the Black Belt for the promise of decent pay and dignified work in Birmingham or the North. Those who stay are accustomed to failure. They are surrounded by ignorance, poverty, and low expectations. Now, this was not well received by some of the folks who live in the region. They didn't like the negative way in which their region was depicted, but for those of us who work there, we realize that there's a lot of truth in that series done by the Birmingham News. It's an area with many challenges, but there is within the region a sense of hope and resilience that the people there are trying to engender. Now, how do we get that way? And we can go back in history. William Faulkner in the novel Requiem for a Nun said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, especially as you look at life in the southern Black Belt. The slide you see shows the concentration of enslaved African Americans in 1850. The darker the areas, are the more heavily concentrated slave populations. And you'll notice that in Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, into Alabama and Mississippi, you see very high concentrations of slaves there. Then if we fast forward a bit into, this is 1990, and we look at counties with persistent poverty, you see a very similar track of counties there from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, into Mississippi, the same places where we had the slave populations. So what we find is that slavery is a footprint on the American South. It's slavery's footprint is a Black Belt. Persistent poverty counties are those that have over 20% in poverty over a number of decades, from 1960 to 2000. Each of the census, those counties were over 20% in poverty. And so there's a real high correlation between slave counties and counties with persistent poverty. This is a slide that looks at Alabama population in 1860. The larger the bubble, the higher the population. So you see that the higher populated counties in Alabama in 1860 were in the Black Belt. This region that goes from the middle of Alabama down through the lower to the eastern region of the state. The blue portions of those bubbles is the percentage of slaves in those counties, and so the higher the number, the blue area, the more slaves were there. And so this was the most populous and the most prosperous area of Alabama at the time of the beginning of the Civil War. And so how did we get to a position where now these areas are sparsely populated, high poverty, and having a number of economic challenges? Well, let's go back to the Civil War. The end of the Civil War, of course, the South was defeated. Alabama's economy, like much of the South, was devastated. Cotton prices dropped as new markets were created around the world during the Civil War. There were blockades of the southern ports. The South couldn't get its cotton to Europe, and so Europe found other sources of cotton, and so the prices dropped. The governments that existed in the South, especially in Alabama, were devastated as well. In Alabama, we lost our highest source of revenue, and that was a tax on slaves. So that was the way we funded government, was through tax on slaves, and we lost that. And during Reconstruction, we were under military rule from the North, and the blacks were allowed to vote. And so we had, during this period, a lot of social programs, greater spending on education. And how do you pay for that? Well, we lost our largest source of revenue. The only way to pay for it was to tax property, and that's what they did. In fact, property tax in Alabama in the period during Reconstruction increased by 350%. And so those large landowners were really hit hard by these new taxes. Also, you found during this period emerging industrialization, especially in the Birmingham area, where you had mining and mills that were created around the Birmingham area, where they had low-wage, low-skill jobs there working in the mines. And also, characteristic of this era was rural poverty. We ended the system of slavery, but replacing it was another kind of economic arrangement where whites were in dominant positions and black worked for whites still on the plantation, but in a different arrangement, where you had tenant farming and sharecropping. With sharecropping, the landowner would give a plot of land to a family to work, and in the end of this growing season, about 50% of the crop's wages would go back to the landowner, and that was the way in which they survived. The tenant farmer or the sharecropper would also have to buy their provisions from a store usually owned by the plantation owner, the landowner, and they would often go in debt because they couldn't pay until the end of the growing season, and so there was a continuing cycle of dependence that was created through this economic system, much like slavery. So the whites remained poor, the poor whites, also the blacks who worked on the plantations were poor, and there was no really way to get out of that cycle because they had no way to move up. Another aspect of this period was the convict lease system, which was a particularly evil kind of arrangement where following the Civil War, during the period of Reconstruction up until the turn of the century, governments began to fill their coffers with leases on their convicts. They would lease convicts from county jails and state prisons to those who owned mines and landowners to work in the mines and the mills. The arrangement was where the sheriffs were in the system. They would arrest largely blacks for no apparent reason. Their vagrancy laws were created that would allow the arrest of folks for laws like having your mule bite someone else's corn or something like that. And so it was easy to round up workers through this convict lease system. In the mines in Birmingham, the mortality rate for those convicts who worked in the mines was about 1 in 4. 1 in 4 died because there was no incentive for those who ran the mines to keep those workers healthy. They would just find others to replace the ones who died. And so it was a particularly evil system. You found throughout the South the number of prisoners increased in Georgia by 10-fold, North Carolina by 4-fold, and Alabama about 5-fold, as you found governments looking for money, and they did it through leasing out convicts to businesses and to farms. So a particularly evil system. So you see throughout this period a continuing system where whites were in control, blacks and poor whites worked in a system of dependence and in a system of abject poverty. And so it was a particularly bad time for the South. After the period of Reconstruction, which ended around 1875, the federal government left. They had been occupying the South, including Alabama, so they left Alabama and other southern states to be governed by their own will. And Alabama created a constitution in 1875. And in that constitution, you had people who created it who were the property owners who were in power. The powers that be came to that constitution in 1875, and they created the constitution. You have to look at, you know, what they had gone through in the years prior. They had seen their property taxes increase by 350%. They had seen government services for poor and blacks increases in spending on education. And so they came to Montgomery to create that constitution with one thing in mind, and that was to limit the power of government. They had seen what government could do in raising taxes and imposing programs they didn't want. So they said, we're going to create a government that does not work in 1875. And that's what they did. So they created a constitution with very low taxes, very limited public services. They made it very difficult for government to do anything without changing the constitution. So they strangled effective government, and they concentrated power in Montgomery. So if a county government, for example, wanted to raise taxes on property, they couldn't do it unless they went to Montgomery for approval. And so power was concentrated in Montgomery, taxes were low, services were minimal, and change was very difficult. And so that's the way they liked it. They created a government that wouldn't work, and it wouldn't regulate and wouldn't tax. Which brings us to the period of the next constitution in 1901. And between 1875 and 1901, it was a period in which there were a number of blacks who were elected to office, a number of blacks were voting, and you had some reforms in education, social services, but the fear was among the powers that be, the large plantation owners and the industrialists in Birmingham, that they were going to lose control. If poor whites and blacks were able to form a coalition and vote together, then they could do things like increase taxes, increase services, and do things they didn't like. So in order to maintain control, they said, we've got to take away the vote of the blacks. And so that's what the purpose was in the 1901 Constitution. And so the president of the convention in 1901 was John Knox from Calhoun County. And here's what he said in his opening address to the convention. But if we would have white supremacy, we must establish it by law. And so the whole purpose of this convention in 1901 was to take away the right of vote for blacks, and in effect also poor whites, because what they did was they enacted poll taxes, property taxes as a way, literacy test as a way to limit the vote of the blacks and in effect poor whites as well. They also sort of established what they did in 1875 with the limits on government, with low taxes, little government services, centralized power in Montgomery. And the result is any time that we want to change government in Alabama for the better at the state or local level, we have to go and amend the Constitution. Now we have well over 800 amendments to the Constitution because that original document in 1901 so restricted government power, put government in a straitjacket, that nothing could be done without getting approval from Montgomery. The legacy of that period, one of the legacies is racism. In 1900, there were 181,000 registered black voters in Alabama. In 1903, there were fewer than 5,000. In the first election after the enactment of the Constitution, overall voter turnout declined by 38%. Of that, white turnout declined by 19%, black turnout by 96%. So effectively, blacks were eliminated as a political force in Alabama with the 1901 Constitution. They were taken out of their role in any effective means of political influence. So the legacies of the 1901 Constitution, one is ineffective government, secondly, racism. If you look at spending before the Constitution and soon after, you see the disparity between spending on whites and blacks. In 1890, the spending was pretty much the same for black and white students in Alabama. In 1910, it's about 4 times as much for white students as for blacks. And it wasn't just that there was a racial disparity. There also was a sense that education in Alabama was not very important. And so a legacy there of low expectations. And here's a quote from the governor of Alabama in 1894, William Oates. He said this: "It is not the duty, nor is it to the interest of the state to educate the entire population beyond the primaries. Universal experience teaches that if a boy, without regard to his color, be educated beyond this point, he declines ever to work another day in the sun." So the idea is we don't need no education. You're just going to ruin a good farmhand or someone who works in the mill or in the mines if you give them education. And so this kind of attitude permeated Alabama for the whole 20th century. And you see a result of that. In spending per pupil compared to the national average, in 1890 it was 28% of the national average. You can go through and see to the point where we're now up to about 81% of the national average in education spending per pupil, but that's still relatively low, but it's much better than we've been in the past. So we're making some progress, but historically in Alabama we have undervalued education. It has not been very important to us because it wasn't part of our economy. Our economy was based on low wages, low skills, and education wasn't that important.